All right, we can go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for joining. As I said, my name is Robert. I'm an engagement director here at Accelirate, and along with Mario Fortney, who's also on the call and be doing this presentation with me today, in which I believe this is our third session on process discovery, in specific our accelerated discovery methodology. We're going to be going over today really how to capture the context, and what that basically means is, okay, now that we have everything understood in terms of our drivers. Now, how do we get that data and transform it into information? So we're going to be going over some of that best practices and how we do that today. Mario, if you want to introduce yourself, then we can go ahead and get started.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mario Fortney. I'm an engagement manager here at Accelerate, as well as a process architect, completing projects doing using our accelerated discovery methodology to find automation candidates and build automation pipelines.
Okay, great. So, Mario, let's just go to the next slide and we can start from there. So if you, of those who have joined the previous sessions, this slide probably doesn't look very new to you, but it is important to kind of give some context of what it is we're going to be discussing. So in this methodology, we have four separate phases. We have our standardize, categorize, organize, and rationalize phase. And as I mentioned in previous calls, the standardize and the rationalize phase are going to be the most important, as well as the ones where the business is going to be most involved. I always like to say to my clients that if we do our jobs correctly after the standardized phase, the next time that you should be meeting with us is when we are actually presenting to you our findings and our plan. So as it relates to this presentation, in capturing the context, this is all held within this standardized phase. And what we're going to be discussing is, once we have our automation motivators understood, we're going to give a brief recap of that in the next slide. What are some of the things that we need to be asking and looking for us to effectively get all of the data necessary for us to move into the categorize and organize phases so we can create our automation pipeline and project plan? So just to kind of give you some context on that. So let's go ahead to that next slide. So what does it really mean? So for process discovery, capturing the context is really about asking the right questions, because we're trying to understand how a department functions, but as well who's involved in that said department. What are some of the dependencies and constraints that go along with being in that department, whether it's an upstream or downstream area within the larger organization, as well as what are some initiatives as it may relate to process improvement, as well as available process metrics that will be very important to us as we move forward, along with some other key areas. So let's start with the who, what, where, when, why, and how. And Mario, I'll take the first three, and then you could take the last, just so we can kind of go a little bit back and forth.
Okay.
As it relates for questions, because I know many people have questions, we're going to save a little bit more time at the end of this call for questions than we have done previously, just because it's inherently a little bit of a shorter presentation, but there's a lot of questions that definitely can be asked, so we're going to allocate a little bit more time accordingly for that. So who? So who are the subject matter experts that can be my guide and resource during this process discovery? So what does that really mean? We already have, at this point, should have an understanding of who our stakeholders are. And we should already have an understanding of what, from a high level, their area or department does. But depending on that said area, department, or industry, it could be extremely complex or very simplistic. And we're really trying to understand that. And the only way of doing so is by first identifying all the parties that are going to be necessary for us to effectively do our discovery. So when we say subject matter experts, that does not mean it's somebody that is on the ground floor. It just means somebody that is that has a solid expertise in one or all of the main functions within that department. And there could be multiple subject matter experts depending on the size of the department. And we'll get into that. So after I've identified the stakeholders, the first thing that we're really trying to establish is what the management layers look like. And there's a reasoning for that. The more management layers there are within a department, inherently, the more difficult it is going to be for your process discovery initiative. If you have a department of 250 people, you're probably going to have at least 2 to 3 management layers, and each of those layers may correspond to one or a group of activities that they are overseeing, with the subject matter experts, quote unquote, being under them. So we want to make sure we understand from a high level, well, how many management layers are there? Because that is going to give us a good indication of how, how in depth or how difficult it is going to be for this process discovery initiative. So what are we going to be asking them once we do have those identified? So our stakeholder should be able to give us who their direct reports are. And direct is the key word there, because obviously everybody would technically report to a stakeholder, a VP of finance or whatnot, but they obviously have a segregation of duties, and that's the entire point of management layers. So they're already doing the work for us by inherently creating these layers. It is our job to identify what it is that those layers are really doing. So the stakeholder should be able to provide us with their direct reports. Now, those direct reports are who we're going to be asking some of these remaining questions to. Because as I said before in the previous sessions, in our methodology, you don't want to just start at the top and work your way down, and vice versa. You don't want to start at the bottom and work your way up. You want to utilize both and meet in the middle. And this methodology and how we are approaching it is how we're going to accomplish that. So your direct reports should be able to give a identification of what it is that their area is doing. So if you see the what are the activities that your team perform, and what are your motivators? Because the stakeholder motivators may be different from the management ones, which may be different from the SMEs. Now, it's important to take all of them into consideration, but at the end of the day, the stakeholder, or the one that is really signing off on the project, is the one that you have to listen to. However, it is always important to have insight as what are the motivators as you move down that layer. Move down those layers. And the reasoning for that is because you're able to have that empathy of understanding how it is that this department or these areas function truly on the ground level. Because the stakeholders, your VPs, your directors of the world, have a very great, good view on how this works from a macro perspective, but not so much on the micro perspective, especially as the departments get larger. So we want to make sure that we are understanding the context from all areas. So that's what we're going to be asking our direct reports, is what is it that they're doing? And if this is a very mature and standardized, no pun intended, department or functional area, it should coincide with what the stakeholder has said to you previously. The larger the differential or the delta between those two interpretations, the greater the likelihood of that particular area or department going to be needing some type of reengineering for you to be able to address it fully, because there's probably a large gap of how things are really functioning between those two areas. So once I have an understanding from my direct reports, okay, what are your activities and what are you really what is really being performed? What I want to be able to get from this is understand, how does it fit within the bigger picture? We've already talked about in our previous sessions, how do you go from an organization level all the way down to a task level? What we didn't say is, what are the questions we're asking for us to get down there? Now, there's not enough time on this call for me to be able to explain every single one. But as it relates to meetings, you want to have all of your management layer meetings accomplished and completed before you move down to your subject matter expert meetings, because there are 3 main meetings that you are going to have in any discovery engagement. You're going to have your stakeholder, which is what we've discussed in the previous sessions, workshops. Then you're going to have your management meeting. Now, depending on the amount of layers, you may have multiple of these. And then you will have your subject matter expert interviews, and they all have different purposes. So I'm going to discuss the latter two, the management meetings and the subject matter expert meetings. The management meetings are really to understand where the variations or variability lies. And Mario will go over that in that why section. But you will see that every department, every area, more than likely will have some type of variations involved into it. And to give you an example, if you're in the financial servicing space and you, let's say you're in the finance sector, you will probably have multiple groups of resources that work on separate account types. So if I'm a financial services, I may have 10 people that only work on this particular type of loan or account type. And I could have 5 people working on another, and so on and so forth. Some of them may even be shared amongst them, depending on the frequency of it. But those are variations nonetheless. So you want to understand where those variations lie, and the best parties of being able to assist you with that are going to be your management, through your management means and those management layers. Like I said, the more layers there are, the more difficult there's going to be. But the reason why is because there's probably going to be more variations. So you may have one variation based on account type, but there also may be a sub variation within that account type that only focuses on these 7 states. So account types, and then these 7 states, only these 3 people work on them. So it could be very difficult if you don't have that context when you're going into your SME meeting, because you may be thinking you're getting an understanding of all the tasks being performed, when in reality you're only looking at one small variation of the overall picture. So that, and from a what perspective, that's what you're really trying to get from your management meetings. Now, from your subject matter expert meetings, by this point, you already have an understanding of how the overlying department functions, how the functional areas work, and what variations they are based on, as well as the motivators of the management layers and stakeholder. Now you're getting into the realm of what are the main tasks that are being performed by the SMEs for these variations. So how do you get that information? First, you want to ask, okay, well, where is it coming from? So here we say, where does the data inputs come from, and where does it go after your team completes it? So why that's important. Your data is being fed from either a system, a file, an email. There's only a couple of variations of where data is coming from and going to. By you understanding that flow and coupling it with the information that's already been gathered prior, this is where you're going to be able to truly contextualize, oh, this is how it works in my finance area for my financial services firm. So many times what you're going to see in many areas, there's going to be master applications, which is what we call them. And this is really going to be the main data source in which all of these SMEs are going to be interacting with. So think of these as your ERPs of the world. So if it's in originations, you may use something like Encompass, SAP, Oracle, Salesforce. It can really vary. But you're going to start to see a trend where all the inputs are going to come from a specific set of places. The less or the more centralized those sources are, the easier it's going to be for you to be able to extract the remaining information from your SME meetings to understand what are all of the tasks actually being performed. So Mario, if I know I went a little bit over there in time, if you could just go over the last 3, we can get to the next slide.
Yeah, sure. So for when, that question can come up at a lot of different levels of your discovery. So, let's say you're getting down to your management level meetings, and or you're talking to different SMEs, and you start to learn about different IT initiatives that the department at large is working on or expecting to go live and all of that. So you may have potential automation candidates that are there, but then there could be some IT initiative that's already ongoing that will completely change that particular process. So then it becomes a question of, well, when is that going to happen? Is it 1 year down the line? Is it 2 years? Is it in the next 6 months? Because then you can decide if it's something that you still want to pursue from an automation perspective, because there could be, depending on the complexity of the automation, it could be worth it to spend the resources to automate this particular task, even with this large IT initiative on the way. You can still get the benefit in the short term while waiting for this long-term implementation to happen. You can also, and then let's say you get down to the process level of things, you can also ask when does a particular process needs to happen? Does it need to happen every morning? Is it daily? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Are there set SLAs that are in place for when the process must be completed? Is it because you receive this automated email every day at 10 a.m. and you have to get the process completed at 12 p.m. because someone down the line has established their SLA for you? So Those type of questions, the timing questions are also important so that you can understand, should you, of course, go forward with an automation and you kind of make that business decision, number one. And then even at the process level, what are your restrictions or constraints as far as when the automation must begin or when it end, or maybe you can have a bot run overnight and you don't have any restrictions in that way. So those just kind of present you your opportunities as far as how I can design this automation. And then secondly, well, next on the list is why. And why is there variability in the way your processes are executed? And that question, why, is I guess in a larger sense, when going forward with your automation mindset, you're essentially rethinking the way that you do everything. And so it's not always just as simple as here's what you do and we should just automate it blindly, right? There could be some re-engineering opportunities to, to gather other efficiencies as well. And so I think questioning why something may be variable when someone says, oh, this is too much variability, I don't know if we can automate it, then you can question why do we do things this way, and that kind of mindset is going to position you to be able to find ways to leverage your automation capabilities via RPA, OCR, other technologies to really transform your organizations. And then lastly, how do you measure performance and productivity of the team? That can be a very important question, and just understanding, especially at the very beginning of your process discovery, and you're just trying to figure out where do you want to spend your time, then those particular metrics kind of informs you what does that particular department consider important, what drives them to perform, what are the metrics that they're tracking, and then those processes that contribute to those metrics may be where you want to spend your time, because not only are you looking for cost savings, there are other benefits, throughput benefits, or just other general qualitative benefits that you want to extract out, as far as if I do automate this, yes, I will receive a cost savings. Yes, I will have a throughput increase. And then maybe I can measure my error reduction. Maybe I can measure how this particular process translates to more revenue for my department, or et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the other types of questions that you want to ask. So at large, the standardized phase is just asking a lot of questions and then using those answers to those questions to continue to ask even better questions.
And so we can go to the next slide, because I want to actually, there you go, talk on that, because you mentioned you have to, asking a lot of questions. Now, what's the difference in just asking a lot of questions and then what we do, right? You have to make sure that you have a set standard of questions, because you need to make sure you have a benchmark in place. I can't give you, of course, over this call, all of the exact questions that we ask as it relates to every meeting, but I can say that in our methodology, we do have that standardization in place, and it's for a reason. Because if we create this benchmark, we are able to tell or compare the efficacy of these discovery efforts across the board. Whereas if you're just asking different questions and you're not having a set standard in place, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to really effectively gauge, was this a good discovery initiative or not? So all of these questions, the who, the what, the when, the where, all of them have sub-questions within them as they relate to the meetings involved. I am not going to be asking the same set of questions in a stakeholder meeting as I'm going to be asking in a SME meeting. And you need to make sure you understand that and have those questions ready for each meeting that you're going to be going into, because you want to understand, what goals am I trying to get out of this meeting? You should never be going into a meeting and not have a clear schedule in place of what it is you are going to be asking and why and what you're trying to get out of it. And going back into this, so the goals and the opportunities, we talk a lot about the motivators, and it's very important. Again, I just want to harp on this, because now that we have that context from that previous slide, the who, the what, the when, the how, depending on these motivators and depending on the context that we are able to extract, that is where we're then going to take that information that we have now gathered, and we can move into our categorize and organize phases. and take the motivators that are needed. So if I have a cost motivator and I now have a lot more context about this area, is this going to satisfy the long-term goal of my client? So if I have a department of 250 and one of that 250 is broken up into 8 areas, and I know that pure cost reduction is, from in terms of FTE resources, the main motivator for the stakeholder of this department, I am not, and let's say one of those areas only has 6 people in it, am I going to be focusing on that area first before the area that has 45? That's how you have to think. And these are the questions you need to make sure you have answered before you move into your categorize and organize phases, because you want to make sure you're including all of the goals, all of the data that's being extracted and being transformed to information. You are now taking that and you are moving in a methodical manner of what pipeline or what solution, what plan you're going to be providing to them. If you spend too much time trying to get every single piece of data and information, you're going to be stuck in a constant state of analysis paralysis. Whereas you should be thinking of it in forms of iterations. Department of 250 people, I may have to do 3 complete iterations of discovery for me to get every single task that's being performed. But if I'm able to get 60 or 70% of all of that data, of all of the tasks being performed in my first iteration, is that enough for me to then implement on that and move to another area in the interim before going back to another discovery phase? That's how you have to think. That's how the automation mindset really works and plays into this. Because if you just try, and the automation mindset shouldn't be, I'm trying to automate everything. What it should be is, how am I leveraging automation to satisfy the motivators of my client and do so in the most effective and efficient manner possible? So just to kind of bring all of that together, and it's 2:24 now. I want to make sure I leave a little bit of time here. Like I said, a little bit more time than usual for questions. So if we just kind of want to skip to there and just see, does anybody have any questions on what we have discussed thus far, whether from this workshop or the previous 2 as well? And you can go ahead and ask that in the chat, or just unmute yourself and speak up. That's no problem.
Okay, RJ, there's a couple in the chat.
Okay.
All right. The first one. What can we do if we don't have any up-to-date org charts to identify SMEs?
Sure. Yeah. Luckily, in my experience, this is not as common of a problem, because most organizations are going to have some type of org chart involved. But let's say in the instance is extremely out of date. You want to make sure you're leveraging as much preliminary documentation as possible. So if you don't have an org chart at all, it's not worth it to you for you to try to completely replicate what the org chart is. Instead, what you should be doing is understand and identify the management layers. And once you have the management layers identified, then understand who are the main SMEs that you are going to be speaking with as it correlates to each management layer. So that's in the instance if you don't have an org chart at all, which again is very uncommon, but it can happen. But if that is the case, you do not want to just recreate an org chart for the client, because that'll just take too much time. And in reality, all we're using that org chart for is to help us better contextualize how the department functions. So if you don't have that, you can still get that context by your stakeholder in your management meetings. You just have to make sure you are asking the correct set of questions for you to identify who are the SMEs involved for those layers and how do they correlate to the layers for the overall department.
Okay, there's another one. This one says, in your experience, what makes process discovery most challenging?
Definitely most challenging, I would say, is going to be really related to your scope. So like I said, oftentimes many people try to just say, okay, I want 100% coverage of this particular department. And when they're trying to do it in that manner, you're inherently not being agile. you're really kind of following a waterfall approach. And you really should be trying to do a hybrid. So one of the challenges is kind of relaying that to the stakeholder and making sure that they understand that it's okay if we don't have 100% coverage or 100% of all work being allocated for yet. What you should be looking to is, am I capturing the majority of it? And if you're capturing the majority of it, then your project plan should inherently have a lot of value tied to it, because you are already allocating for majority of the work and what solutions that can be applied to it. And as long as you get over that 50 to 60% range in your first iteration, that should, if you're keeping into consideration what are the motivators for that particular business unit, that should be enough for first iteration to really showcase value. And once you have that value showcased and that buy-in solidified, then you can either decide after that implementation to, do I do another round of discovery for this department to try to get that work that's been accounted for to a higher number, or do I wait for these projects that I have suggested for this discovery round? Do I wait for those to be implemented to see the value that has been delivered before I go back and then work on another area entirely in the interim? So the challenge there is which one do you decide? And I think it kind of ties a little bit back into, well, what is your buy-in? If you have a lot of buy-in from your stakeholders, then it may be better for you to just finish your first phase of discovery for the department in question, and then wait for the implementation to be completed for you to actualize that ROI, and in the interim focus on other areas. Because once that is complete, you still already have roadmaps for other departments as well, where then you can make a decision: do I move forward with implementing on this next department, or do I go back for another iteration on the current department in question?
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, so I think you are all set.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, again, you can reach out to Megan or myself or Mario, and we'd be more than happy to answer or assist with anything.
All right, sounds good.